"Don't ruin this day," my son said, straightening my tie as if I were a stranger he had to prepare for inspection. His voice was quiet enough not to carry past the doorway, but sharp enough to cut through the years between us. The morning light spilled across the suit I had ironed by hand, each crease holding a memory of nights spent mending and making do. For a moment, I thought of telling him that I had paid for this day long before either of us stood in this hallway, that every brick, every invitation, every polished word in his speech had been bought with something I had given up. But instead, I nodded. I felt that old, familiar fear of taking up space, of being the shadow in someone else's perfect photograph. I could hear guests already arriving, their laughter carrying the easy music of people who believe they know the story they're walking into. My hand drifted toward the inside of my jacket, brushing against the folded paper tucked deep in the lining. The letter. My letter. Written late last night when sleep wouldn't come, when the truth refused to stay buried. It was not long, but it was heavy. I slipped it back into my pocket as if sliding a blade into its sheath, not to harm, but to keep ready. There are moments in a life when silence feels like love, and moments when silence feels like surrender. I wasn't sure yet which this would be. He stepped back, looked me over like a man checking a lock, and gave a small, approving nod, as though my compliance were part of his plan. We stepped out into the brightness, the sound of cameras already waiting for him. And I thought, not for the first time. The world was about to hear his version of our story. But before the day was over, I would decide whether they would hear mine. Friends, let me pause for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This is how you help us grow our channel. Now, let's continue. The car moved through the city like a slow current, carrying us toward the place where his version of the day would be set in stone. Beside me he spoke in a measured rhythm, reciting his speech from memory, the cadence smooth from weeks of practice. I recognized every sentence. I had been there when they were born, shaping the edges, trimming the excess, strengthening the weak spots. But here, in the confined space between us, I could also hear what was missing. Whole passages I had written for him, the ones that marked the beginning, the long stretch of road before the map was even drawn, had been lifted out, leaving the structure intact but the foundation invisible. Every gap was a small wound, deliberate and clean, the kind that doesn't bleed but still stings when you run your fingers over it. I turned my face toward the window, watching the city slip past in fragments. A woman with her collar turned up against the wind. A boy dragging a violin case heavier than his stride. A man bent over a cart of oranges, hands raw from the cold. Each image passed like a torn page drifting away, impossible to retrieve. That's what it felt like, watching our shared history move past me, stripped from the narrative, fading into the rearview mirror. I told myself it didn't matter. That love, real love, should be able to survive the absence of credit. That my worth was not measured by whether or not I was named in a room full of strangers. The lie was comforting in its simplicity and heavy in its weight. It sat quietly inside me, well-behaved, like an animal that knows how to stay in its cage, but I could feel it breathing. The hum of the engine filled the silence between his lines, the silence where my name should have lived. I knew that, when we arrived, he would step out into the camera's light, the day's story already rehearsed into muscle memory. And I would follow, my own lines unspoken, carrying a truth no one had asked for, but that still waited, folded and patient, just beneath the surface of my stillness. The rhythm of the car on the road began to pull me backward, not in miles but in years, into the places where this day first began. The sound of tires over asphalt became the low thrum of factory machines in the midnight hours, the hiss of steam when I turned valves with hands so tired they shook. I could smell the metallic bite of oil on my clothes, the faint burn of soldering fumes that clung to my skin even after the longest showers. There were nights I walked home under streetlights that flickered like they were deciding whether to stay lit, the city asleep while I carried the weight of keeping us afloat. I remembered the day I pawned my wedding ring, Not because I wanted to, but because the rent didn't care about sentiment. I stood in that shop with my fingers clenched, my reflection in the glass looking like a man who had traded something sacred for something necessary. There were the loan papers, spread out on a cracked wooden desk in a bank office that smelled faintly of stale coffee. My hand shook as I signed them, not from fear of the debt, but from the knowledge that I had no safety net if I fell. I was building a bridge while already halfway across it, trusting that the boards I laid would hold his steps, even if they splintered under mine. I thought about all the doors I had opened for him, literal and not. Job interviews I walked him into wearing my best shirt, though the cuffs were frayed. School meetings where I took the blame for lateness so he wouldn't feel the sting of it. Moments when my own opportunities were within reach, and I let them go because his path needed the space to grow straight. I didn't do any of it to be thanked. Gratitude was never the currency I worked for. I built what I built so he could walk without feeling the ground shift beneath him, so he could stand on floors I had leveled with my own knees. This day was part of that construction, a room whose walls I had raised without leaving my name in the blueprint. And yet, as the car moved us closer to it, I felt the faintest tremor under my feet, as if the foundation had begun to remember who laid it. The building rose ahead of us, all glass and stone, reflecting the late afternoon light in a way that made it seem taller than it was. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of polished wood and expensive perfume, the hum of anticipation weaving between soft laughter and the shuffling of programs. People were already taking their places, their movements choreographed by habit and hierarchy. I followed the flow toward the front, and that's when I saw them. The chairs marked with neat white cards, each one bearing a title in bold black letters: Chairman, Donor, Guest of Honor, Keynote Sponsor. The names were crisp, the lines clean. None of them read Father. That space, I knew, was never printed. It existed only in blood and memory, and neither of those were currency here. An usher in a pressed vest approached, her smile polite but distant, the kind given to someone you are guiding, not greeting. She gestured toward a seat along the aisle, several rows back from the stage. The kind of seat you give someone who matters just enough to be included, but not enough to be seen. I nodded, offering no protest. Dignity doesn't argue for furniture. It carries itself, even when the space offered is smaller than it deserves. As I walked toward my place, my fingers brushed against the inside of my jacket, feeling for the fold of the letter. It was there, firm under my touch, like a railing in a dark stairwell, something to hold on to when the steps ahead are uncertain. I let my hand rest there for a moment longer than necessary, grounding myself in the simple knowledge that the truth was still with me even if I had no reserved seat to anchor me here. The room settled into a low murmur as people exchanged greetings, checked their watches, and glanced toward the empty podium. From where I sat, I could see the stage clearly, but I knew no one would see me unless they were looking for me, and that was fine. The absence of my name on the front row didn't erase my place in the story. It only meant the story had been arranged, so the audience wouldn't notice it. I sat back, hands folded loosely in my lap, the letter a quiet weight against my side. Around me, the lights shifted subtly, drawing the focus forward. I could feel the room preparing for the version of events it had come to hear, the one polished enough to reflect well on everyone involved. But somewhere in the seams of this evening, the truth waited, patient and certain, knowing that a seat without a plaque is still a place from which someone can stand. They came in pairs, in clusters, trailing perfume and polished shoes, their voices dressed in compliments that didn't touch the ground, smiles that landed on him like confetti, while their eyes slid past me as if I were part of the furniture, a chair they had once borrowed, worn out, and returned without thanks. I stood near the edge of the hall, watching them greet him, clasp his shoulders, pose for the waiting cameras. My name was not spoken, but I could hear its absence. It had a sound like a door closing slowly, softly enough to pretend it was never open. Someone, a cousin I'd not seen since he borrowed money and forgot to return it, leaned toward another guest and murmured, "Let him shine," tilting his chin in my direction, as though my very existence risked stealing the spotlight. The words were not meant for me, but they found me anyway, they always do. There's a particular sting in being treated like an uninvited guest at a life you built, brick by brick. I smiled faintly, the way you do when the wound is too old to bleed in public, but inside the ache stirred. The same ache I had felt at school plays where my name was left out of programs, at graduation ceremonies where my seat was in the back row, at hospital waiting rooms where my presence was politely unacknowledged. It is a strange cruelty to be told that your love becomes selfish the moment it asks to be seen. That sacrifice, once complete, should be stored in silence, hidden from view, so that others can pretend the harvest grew without the seed. I took a sip of water to keep my hands from tightening into fists, my eyes tracing the room not for allies but for the truth. I had given him everything I could, and now I was being asked to give him my invisibility too. He caught my gaze across the crowd, his smile holding steady for the cameras, but his eyes narrowing in that familiar way. Half warning, half plea. I slipped my hand into my pocket, feeling for the letter again. The paper was warm against my fingers like it had a pulse. It whispered that there are moments when dignity is not in staying quiet, but in deciding when to speak. And though the music swelled, the laughter rose, and the room sparkled with celebration, I could feel the edges of this day sharpening, cutting, preparing for something that would not stay hidden much longer. He stood at the podium like a man who had been rehearsing his whole life for this moment. The lights caught the edge of his suit, the perfect drape of the fabric, the steady rise and fall of his breath. The crowd leaned forward, eager to be part of the memory he was about to make. His voice was confident, warm in the way that charms a room into believing it knows the whole truth. He began with a story, his story, how he started with nothing but determination, how he fought through obstacles, how, against all odds, he arrived here. The words poured out like polished stones, smooth from being turned over again and again, until every rough edge had been worn away. He thanked the mentors who had been there from the start, though I knew they arrived years after the foundation had been laid. He spoke of friends who always believed, though I remembered the empty chairs, the unanswered calls, the days when belief was a luxury we couldn't afford. Then came the list, the long, shining list of names. Sponsors who came for the photo opportunities, investors who appeared only after success was certain, colleagues who stood beside him when the cameras were rolling, but not in the dark days before. He said we and meant they, and every omission of my name was deliberate, an invisible red pen crossing me out in real time. The audience clapped after each line, their applause acting like a seal on the version of history he was writing before their eyes. I felt the sound in my chest, not like music, but like a drum beat at the wrong tempo. My hands stayed folded in my lap, but the letter in my pocket seemed to press harder against my side, as if reminding me it existed for exactly this moment. Every cheer from the crowd was a verdict, loud, public, final. He was making the case that I had been a spectator, not a builder, a bystander, not a foundation. And the more they believed it, the more I wondered if he believed it too, or if this was simply the easier story to tell. There is a particular kind of betrayal that does not shout or accuse. It wears a smile, speaks in perfect sentences, and never once says your name. And there I sat, listening to my own absence being applauded, feeling the room grow brighter for him and dimmer for me, until all that remained was the quiet weight of a truth I was no longer sure I could keep to myself. While the applause swelled around him like a tide, my hand slipped into the inside of my jacket, brushing over the familiar ridge of stitches. I had sewn that seam myself years ago, not for fashion, but for safekeeping, for moments when something precious needed to be carried close to the heart, shielded from curious eyes. My fingers found the soft fold of paper tucked there, the edges worn from being handled in the quiet hours of the night. The letter was warm, as if it had been absorbing the heat of my body all day, waiting. It was not a speech, not a plea, not even an accusation. It was a witness, silent until called, unshaken by the noise around it. Every line in it was a receipt written in ink and sacrifice, the rent paid with coins scraped from the bottom of a jar, the meals skipped so his plate would stay full, the sleepless nights spent at a second job while the rest of the city slept. It was a record of the invisible architecture I had built, so he could walk through doors without wondering how the hinges were paid for. And yet, the letter was not built only from the currency of hardship. Woven into it was mercy. Mercy for him, for the years he might one day look back on and see differently. I had shaped it not like a knife to cut him down, but like a door he could walk through when the weight of his version of events became too heavy to bear. It was there to remind him that love is not erased by being forgotten, but it does deserve to be remembered. I thought of the night before, the pen heavy in my hand, the lamp throwing its light across the table while the world outside was silent. Every word I wrote was measured, not for vengeance, but for truth. Truth that did not shout. Truth that could stand in the center of a crowded room without raising its voice and still change the air. My thumb smoothed the crease down the middle of the page. It was a habit, something I'd done a dozen times without noticing, but now it felt like a decision. Like my hand was reminding me that the choice to keep or reveal it was mine alone. Above the laughter, the clinking glasses, and his well-rehearsed gratitude, I could hear a quieter sound, my own pulse, steady and certain, telling me that before this day ended, this letter might not stay in the lining any longer. The last words of his speech hung in the air like a closing curtain, and for a heartbeat, the room was still. Then the applause erupted, warm and glittering, a standing ovation that wrapped around him like a crown. People surged to their feet, smiling, clapping, some wiping their eyes as if they had witnessed the whole truth and nothing but the truth. He stepped back from the podium, basking in it, his shoulders squared with the confidence of a man certain he had delivered exactly what they came for. Then his gaze found me. It wasn't a casual glance, it was a check, a quick scan to see if the fire had stayed in its extinguisher. His eyes held mine for a fraction longer than necessary, and in that space I saw it clearly, the quiet, unspoken hope that I would remain part of the furniture, that my silence, which had carried him this far, would carry him through this day as well. The look he gave me was the same one a man gives to a fire alarm in a crowded theater, knowing it could change everything in an instant if it went off, praying it never does. The crowd still clapped, still roared his name, but between us there was another conversation, one no one else could hear. I remembered the words he'd whispered to me that morning, his hands on my tie, his voice low enough to hide the edge in it. Don't ruin this day. Back then, I'd let them settle in my chest like a stone, not fully weighing what they meant. But now, standing here with the letter in my jacket and the truth in my pocket, I understood. He hadn't meant don't cause trouble. He hadn't meant don't embarrass him. He meant something far more specific. Don't change the story. Don't introduce a version that doesn't sparkle for the cameras. Don't remind them that the road he claimed to have built was first paved with someone else's calloused hands. Don't shift the light so it falls anywhere but on him. And here we were, the applause still rattling the walls, the room still blinded by the glow of his ending. Yet I knew his story wasn't finished, not really. The real ending was still in my lining, folded in two, waiting for me to decide whether this was the day it would step out into the light. My hand brushed against it again, and for the first time that evening, I felt my own heartbeat match the rhythm of the choice I was about to make. I rose slowly, not with the quick, eager energy of someone rushing to join the celebration, but with the deliberate weight of a man who knows exactly where he is going, and where he isn't. The chairs around me creaked softly as people glanced over, assuming I was heading for the stage to offer a handshake, a hug, a photograph. But my steps angled toward the back of the room, toward the door that had stood quietly all evening, unnoticed, like a witness waiting for its moment to testify. The applause was still crashing around us, each clap like the closing of a lock on the version of events he had just delivered. I moved through it as though walking under water, my breath slow, my vision narrowing not on the sea of smiling faces, but on that door, the simplest of hinges, the plainest of wood. Yet in that moment, it felt like the most powerful instrument in the room. Justice, I realized, does not always arrive in a roar or in the echo of a microphone. Sometimes it comes in the sound of footsteps crossing a floor and the click of a latch as it opens. With each step, the letter pressed against my side, a silent weight reminding me I had choices. I could stop. I could turn around. I could walk to the stage and speak into the same microphone that had just erased me. But that would make it about the crowd, about performance, about winning an argument in front of strangers, and this was not for them. This was between him and me, and the truth that stood between us like a locked door only I had the key to. As I neared the back, I felt the hum of the room dim, not in volume, but in relevance. It no longer mattered what they thought or how they clapped. What mattered was that I was moving under my own will, not as a prop in his story, but as the author of my own exit. There is a particular dignity in leaving a place without waiting to be told you may. The door was close now, close enough for me to see the faint scratches in the paint, the worn brass of the handle. I reached for it, the metal cool under my fingers, and in that instant I felt it, an almost physical alignment between my hand, my heart, and the truth. The hinge waited, patient as time itself, knowing that when I pushed, it would not just open to the street, it would open to the moment where I stopped being erased. Halfway to the door I heard the shift in the room, not in the applause, which was still fading, but in the hurried rhythm of footsteps behind me. His footsteps. He cut through the aisles with the urgency of someone chasing a threat, not a father. When he reached me, his breath was shallow, his hand brushing my arm as if contact alone could anchor me in place. The smile he had worn on stage was gone, replaced by a tightness around his mouth and the glint of something raw in his eyes. "Dad, please, don't make a scene." His voice was low, almost swallowed by the murmurs of the crowd. A bead of sweat traced down from his temple, catching the light before disappearing into his collar. He looked at me as though I were holding a match above a field of dry grass. Slowly, I turned to face him, my expression calm, steady, because it wasn't anger that had brought me to my feet. It was the truth, and the truth has no need to shout. My hand slipped into my jacket, past the familiar seam, and came out with the letter. It lay in my palm like something alive, creased from the folding, warm from being carried close all day, and undefeated despite its quiet nature. I didn't thrust it at him. I didn't raise my voice. I simply held it out, the same way you might offer someone the last piece of evidence they need to see before deciding what side they're on. "Then read it," I said, my tone even, my gaze fixed on his. "After your speech." For a second he didn't move. His eyes flicked from my face to the paper, as if unsure which was the greater threat. Around us people were beginning to notice, not the letter itself, but the pause, the stillness between us, the way the air seemed to lean closer to hear. His fingers twitched, the faintest sign of hesitation, before he took it. Our hands touched briefly, and in that moment I felt something pass between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the weight of a shared history neither of us could rewrite, no matter how carefully he chose his words in front of an audience. I stepped back, giving him space, but my eyes didn't leave his. Whatever he decided to do with that letter would not erase the fact that it was now in his possession. The truth was no longer mine alone to carry. It was his too, whether he wanted it or not. And as he looked down at the folded paper, his thumb brushing over the crease as if testing its strength, I saw the smallest crack in his composure, the first sign that his version of the story might not be the only one left standing by the end of the night. The applause had already begun to scatter into conversations, chairs scraping against the floor, glasses clinking at the bar. But the moment he took the letter, something shifted. Curiosity spread through the room like a quiet ripple. People paused mid-sentence, forks hovering above plates, eyes drawn to him not because he was still the man from the stage, but because now he held something fragile in his hands. He looked down at the paper as if it might vanish if he unfolded it too quickly. His fingers worked at the crease, slow and careful. The way you handle an heirloom you've just discovered belongs to you. The once crisp fold gave way, revealing the handwriting he had seen before only in birthday cards and hastily signed school forms. But here, the lines were long, deliberate, each word carrying weight. The room seemed to draw in a breath as he began to read. His voice, moments ago so steady and rehearsed, now carried an uneven edge, as though the syllables were catching on something in his throat. He read about the winters we spent in cold apartments, where the walls whispered at night. He read about the second jobs I took when the first ones couldn't stretch far enough. The graveyard shifts that left my eyes burning but his lunchbox full. He read about the hours spent fixing, mending, patching, not just shoes and clothes, but dreams that threatened to fray before they ever had a chance to fit him. And he read about the art of disappearing, the way I learned to step aside so he could step forward, how I became fluent in making myself small enough to fit in the shadows of his growing life. Not because I wanted to vanish, but because I wanted him to arrive. The noise of the room was gone now, no clinking, no chatter, only the sound of his voice carrying my truth across the space between us and the people who had just cheered for a story with my name cut out. His eyes flicked to mine once, mid-sentence, and I saw something there I hadn't seen in years. Not pride, not defensiveness, just the dawning realization of the cost. He kept reading, and with each line, the version of events he had offered them began to shift, its shine tempered by the weight of what had been left unsaid. He was not performing now, he was witnessing, and everyone in that room was hearing my absence turn into presence, word by word, breath by breath. No one clapped when he reached the end of that first page. No polite applause, no clearing of throats to break the tension. They simply listened, still and intent, as if the air itself had shifted its purpose from filling lungs to carrying meaning. The room, moments ago so loud with celebration, now felt like a church where truth had taken the pulpit. He read on, and new names began to surface, names that had never made it onto his speech or the printed program. Neighbors who left covered plates at our door when they thought we wouldn't accept help if we saw the hands that gave it. A nurse at the clinic who quietly adjusted the bill so we could keep the lights on one more month. A teacher who noticed the holes in my shoes one winter morning and sent me home with a pair from her own son. Each name was spoken without grandeur, but each one landed heavy, a pebble dropped into still water, sending out rings that touched every person listening. These were not benefactors in suits. They were not sponsors with their names engraved on plaques. They were ordinary souls who gave without the expectation of being remembered. And here they were, remembered aloud in a room that had forgotten them. Then came the part I had almost left out when I wrote it, the lines that offered something harder than truth: forgiveness. Forgiveness for those who had been there, but looked away. For the relatives who had congratulated him without once asking how he got there. For the friends who only showed up when there was champagne to drink and cameras to smile into. I hadn't named them, but they knew who they were, and still, the letter forgave. His voice faltered on those lines. Not because the words were hard to pronounce, but because they were harder to carry. Forgiveness weighs more than blame. It asks you to lift it with both hands, and in that moment, I could see him feeling the full weight. Around us, heads had tilted forward, eyes fixed on him. They were beginning to understand this wasn't just my letter, it was our shared language. The unglamorous, uncelebrated vocabulary of nights endured and kindnesses tucked into the cracks of survival. A language the room hadn't known it spoke until it was spoken to them. He lowered the paper slightly, just enough to glance at me again, and there was something unsteady in his face, as though the words he was reading were not just telling my story, they were beginning to tell his too. Near the end, the tone of the letter shifts. The earlier lines had been threads, pulling memories and names into the open, weaving gratitude and quiet absolution. But then came the two sentences I had written, knowing they would either break the room open or seal it shut. He reached them, and for the briefest moment, his voice stopped. The pause was thin, but noticeable, like the hesitation before a verdict is read. When he spoke again, his words landed without ornament, stripped bare of the performance he had worn earlier. I will not ruin this day, I will correct its record. The sound of it seemed to change the air. There was no anger in the sentence, no raised voice, yet it struck with the force of a gavel hitting wood. It made plain what had been happening all along. The day was not being torn down, but rebuilt. I had not come to set fire to his triumph, but to restore the missing beams so it could stand without the scaffolding of omission. He swallowed, his throat working hard before he continued to the next line, a line I had debated cutting, but left because it was the truest thing I could write. I am not leaving angry. I am leaving accurately. That word, accurately, seemed to ripple through the crowd. People shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others glancing sideways at the faces near them, as though quietly measuring which version of the story they had believed. It was such a simple distinction, anger versus accuracy, but in that moment it drew a line down the center of the room. From where I stood, I could see his grip on the letter tighten just slightly. I wondered if he could feel it too, that this was the point where the narrative had tipped. No longer entirely his, no longer entirely mine, but something that belonged to the truth alone. He looked up, scanning the audience without really seeing them, then found my face again. And there it was in his eyes. Not defiance, not shame, but the faint recognition that he had been measured, and the scale had spoken. Those two sentences had done what hours of argument could never have done. They had judged us both, without malice, without noise, and without appeal. When he reached the final line, the silence in the room was so complete, it felt as though even the lights had dimmed to listen. Then, slowly, they rose, not with the fevered energy from before, but with something softer, almost reverent. This was not applause for a performance. This was the standing of people who had been shown a truth they could not unhear. Their faces were quieter now, their smiles tempered. The shine was still there, but it had changed, less like gold, more like sunlight after rain. He folded the letter carefully, the same way one might fold a flag after a long battle. When his eyes found me again, they no longer carried the careful distance of a man protecting his image. They were open, bare, and uncertain. His mouth parted as though he might say nothing, then everything, and finally he managed only 2 words. "Dad, I'm sorry." The way he said it told me it wasn't for the room. It wasn't a gesture meant to be overheard or photographed. It was smaller than that, and because of that, it was bigger. His voice had lost the smooth certainty from the stage, replaced by something unpracticed and human. This wasn't an apology built for show, it was an admission built for change. I held his gaze and nodded once. I didn't reach for him, didn't try to soften the weight of what he had just learned. Some apologies are like keys. They unlock something that has been shut for too long. Others are like maps. They don't fix where you are, but they show you how to get somewhere better. This one, I knew, was both. The room's attention still lingered on us, but I hardly noticed anymore. In that moment, the air between us felt like a door I had once closed to protect myself, now quietly opening again. Not all the way, not yet, but enough for light to come through. He glanced down at the folded paper still in his hand, almost as if realizing for the first time that it now belonged to him, and perhaps so did the responsibility that came with it, not just to remember but to tell it right next time. I felt no need to say more. The truth had already been spoken, and the rest of the journey, I suspected, would happen not under a ceiling of applause, but in the quieter rooms where real repair is done. We left without hurry, our steps finding the same slow rhythm as the crowd's murmur faded behind us. The doors ahead glowed faintly from the streetlights outside, their glass catching a reflection of the 2 of us walking side by side, his shoulders no longer squared in performance, mine no longer drawn tight with the weight of being unseen. The air felt different here, thinner, freer, as though every step toward that exit was unwinding the knot that had sat in my chest all day. When we reached the threshold, I stopped. He turned to me, uncertain, still holding the letter as if it were something fragile and unfinished. I could see in his face the questions he wasn't yet ready to ask, the guilt that had not fully taken shape, the beginnings of a humility that might one day grow into something stronger. Without a word, I reached out and closed his fingers more tightly around the paper. "Keep it," I said, my voice quiet enough that it was only for him. "So the next speech doesn't need it." His grip tightened, and for a moment I thought he might speak, but instead he simply nodded. And in that silence I felt the truth settle, not just between us, but in him. This was no longer about a single night's omission or a single room's applause. This was about memory and the choice of what we carry forward. I stepped out into the evening, the cool air folding around me like something earned. The building loomed behind, but I didn't glance back. Some victories don't require a return look. Justice had been delivered without thunder, without spectacle, and yet I knew it would leave an echo in that room, one that would hum in the walls long after the chairs were stacked and the lights turned off. And though I left the celebration, I did not leave my son. I left the version of him that had forgotten me, so the one who remembered could take my place, the one who would walk into future rooms with a story intact, carrying not just his own triumphs, but the truth of where they began. That was the goodbye that stayed, not an ending, but a turning, quiet and certain, toward a chapter we would write together, this time with every name in its rightful place.